studio was silent, but the tension was loud. Millions were watching when Clint Eastwood crossed a line no one expected. He didn't just challenge Bruce Lee, he insulted his mother on live TV. For a split second, the entire room froze. Cameras kept rolling, the audience held their breath. Because everyone knew Bruce Lee wasn't just a fighter. He was a man of honor. People expected anger. They expected an explosion. But what Bruce Lee did next, no one saw coming. Instead of reacting with rage, he delivered something far more powerful, something that left Clint Eastwood stunned, the audience speechless, and the entire studio in complete shock. Because sometimes, the strongest response isn't a punch, it's something much deeper. The lights in the studio were brighter than usual that evening, casting a sharp glow across the polished stage and the neatly arranged seating area. Every detail had been carefully prepared, every camera angle rehearsed, every segment timed down to the second. It was supposed to be another smooth live broadcast, an engaging mix of conversation, charisma, and controlled entertainment. But beneath the surface, there was an energy in the air that no one could quite explain. A quiet tension that seemed to linger as the audience settled into their seats. Bruce Lee sat calmly, his posture relaxed yet alert, his presence commanding, without effort. Even in stillness, there was something about him that drew attention, an intensity behind his eyes, a quiet confidence that didn't need to be announced. He wasn't just another guest. He was already becoming a global phenomenon, a man whose philosophy and skill had begun to reshape how people saw martial arts and discipline. The audience admired him, some out of curiosity, others out of respect, and a few simply because they had heard the stories, the speed, the power, the almost unreal precision. Across from him sat Clint Eastwood, equally composed but carrying a different kind of aura. He had the confidence of a man who had spent years in front of cameras, someone used to being in control of the moment. His expressions were subtle, his words measured, but there was an unmistakable edge to his demeanor that hinted at something more beneath the surface. The producers had likely expected a dynamic exchange, two strong personalities sharing perspectives, maybe even a bit of playful tension to keep the audience engaged. At first, everything unfolded exactly as planned. The conversation flowed naturally, moving from career highlights to personal philosophies. Bruce Lee spoke with clarity and conviction, explaining his views on martial arts not just as combat, but as a way of understanding oneself. His words carried depth, touching on discipline, self-expression, and the importance of adaptability. The audience listened closely, occasionally nodding, occasionally applauding, drawn in by the sincerity of his voice. Clint Eastwood responded with his own experiences, speaking about acting, storytelling, and the challenges of maintaining authenticity. In a world driven by image, there was a rhythm to the exchange, a balance that made it feel like a meeting of minds rather than a clash of egos. The host seemed pleased, guiding the discussion smoothly, occasionally stepping in to steer the conversation or highlight a particular point. But then something shifted. It was subtle at first. A change in tone, a slight tightening in the air. Clint's remarks began to carry a sharper edge, his words becoming less about shared ideas and more about questioning. It wasn't immediately obvious to everyone, but those paying close attention could sense it. The conversation started to drift away from neutral ground, inching toward something more personal. A comment was made, one that could have been brushed off as humor but didn't quite land that way. There was a brief pause, a flicker of reaction in the audience, but the moment passed quickly. The host attempted to keep things light, offering a quick remark to smooth it over. Bruce Lee remained composed, his expression unchanged, his gaze steady. Then came the moment that changed everything. Clint Eastwood leaned slightly forward, his voice carrying clearly through the studio. What he said next wasn't framed as a joke nor softened by context. It was direct, unexpected, and it crossed a line that no one had anticipated. He brought Bruce Lee's mother into the conversation, not as a point of admiration or respect, but in a way that felt dismissive, even insulting. For a fraction of a second, the room seemed to stop breathing. The audience didn't react immediately. It was as if their minds needed time to process what had just been said. A few exchanged glances, unsure if they had heard correctly. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing that something had gone wrong, something that couldn't simply be laughed away. The host froze, his smile faltering as he realized the gravity of the situation. Live television didn't allow for rewinds or edits. There was no way to take back what had just been said. The cameras continued to roll, capturing every detail. The expressions, the silence, the growing tension that filled the space. All eyes turned to Bruce Lee. In that moment, the expectations were clear. People anticipated a reaction, anger, confrontation, something explosive. After all, this wasn't just a casual remark. In many cultures, especially for someone like Bruce Lee, family held deep significance. Respect for one's parents was not optional, it was fundamental. To insult someone's mother, especially in such a public setting, was more than just a personal attack. It was a challenge, a test of character. The silence stretched, heavy and unrelenting. Bruce Lee didn't move immediately. He remained still, his face calm, but there was a subtle shift in his presence. It was almost imperceptible, yet undeniable. The energy around him seemed to change, as if the air itself had become more focused, more intense. His eyes steady and unwavering, locked onto Clint Eastwood. The audience could feel it. Some leaned forward slightly, drawn into the moment despite the discomfort. Others sat rigid, unsure of what would happen next. The tension was no longer just in the room, it was in every heartbeat, every breath, every second that passed without a response. Clint Eastwood, perhaps realizing too late what he had done, maintained his composure, but there was a hint of uncertainty now. The confidence that had defined his earlier remarks seemed to waver just slightly. He had made his statement, but now he had to face the response, and in that moment, even he couldn't predict what it would be. The host glanced between them, searching for a way to regain control, but there was no easy path forward. Interrupting could make things worse. Ignoring it was impossible. The moment demanded resolution, yet no one knew how it would unfold. The cameras captured everything, the stillness, the anticipation, the unspoken questions hanging in the air. Millions of viewers at home were witnessing it in real time, their own reactions mirroring those in the studio. Social expectations, cultural values, personal pride, all collided in that single instant. Bruce Lee finally shifted slightly, not with aggression, but with intention. It wasn't a sudden movement, not a reaction driven by impulse. It was deliberate, controlled, as if every action had been carefully chosen. His calm demeanor remained intact, but there was now a deeper intensity behind it, a quiet strength that seemed to fill the space around him. The audience held its breath. No one spoke. No one dared to break the silence. What had started as a simple conversation had transformed into something far more significant. A moment that would define not just the individuals involved, but the way people understood respect, restraint, and the true meaning of strength. The silence that followed the insult didn't feel ordinary. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was heavy, almost physical, pressing down on everyone in the studio. The audience sat frozen, caught between disbelief and anticipation, unsure of whether they were witnessing a moment that would erupt into chaos or transform into something else entirely. Every eye remained fixed on Bruce Lee, waiting for the reaction that seemed inevitable. Because in that moment, the expectation was clear. People expected anger. They expected Bruce Lee to rise from his seat, his legendary speed and intensity translating into a visible display of fury. After all, his reputation wasn't just built on philosophy. It was built on power, precision, and an unmatched ability to dominate in physical confrontation. The stories people had heard, the demonstrations they had seen, the aura he carried, it all pointed to one thing. If anyone had the right and the ability to respond forcefully, it was him. But Bruce Lee didn't move the way people expected. There was no sudden shift, no aggressive posture, no immediate retaliation. Instead, he remained seated, his body relaxed, his breathing steady. It was as if the insult had not shaken him at all, or perhaps more accurately, as if he had chosen not to be shaken. That distinction mattered, though most people in the room didn't fully understand it yet. His eyes, however, told a different story. They were focused, sharp, locked onto Clint Eastwood with a calm intensity that was impossible to ignore. There was no hatred in them, no visible anger, but there was awareness, complete and unwavering. It was the kind of gaze that didn't just look at someone, but seemed to see through them, to understand not just what had been said, but why it had been said. That alone was enough to shift the energy in the room. Clint Eastwood, who moments ago had appeared completely in control, now seemed slightly less certain. It wasn't obvious at first glance, but it was there, in the subtle tightening of his jaw, in the way his posture adjusted just slightly, as if he were bracing for something he couldn't quite predict. He had expected a reaction, perhaps even welcomed it, but this wasn't what he had prepared for. The host, still caught in the middle of the unfolding tension, forced a faint smile, as if trying to guide the situation back to safer ground. But the effort felt hollow. Everyone knew the conversation had crossed into a different territory now, one where scripted questions and rehearsed responses no longer applied, and still, Bruce Lee remained calm. Seconds passed, though they felt much longer. In those seconds, something remarkable was happening, something that most people wouldn't immediately recognize. Bruce Lee wasn't just choosing not to react, he was choosing how to respond. There was a difference, and it was a difference rooted deeply in his philosophy. For Bruce Lee, martial arts had never been about aggression alone. It was about control. Control of the body, yes, but more importantly, control of the mind. Anyone could throw a punch in anger. Anyone could lash out when provoked. But to remain composed in the face of disrespect, to hold your ground without losing yourself to emotion, that required a different kind of strength. And that was the strength he was demonstrating now. The audience began to sense it, even if they couldn't fully articulate it. The tension didn't disappear, but it changed. It became less about waiting for an explosion and more about witnessing something deeper, something quieter, yet far more powerful. Bruce Lee finally moved, but the movement was minimal, a slight adjustment in his posture, a subtle shift that seemed to center him even more firmly in the moment. When he spoke, his voice was calm, steady, and clear. There was no trace of anger in it, no raised tone, no sharp edge. It carried the same composed confidence that had defined his earlier words, but now there was an added weight to it, a gravity that made every syllable matter. The contrast was striking. Where others might have responded with emotion, he responded with clarity. Where others might have allowed the insult to dictate their reaction, he chose to rise above it. It wasn't passive, and it wasn't weak. It was deliberate. Clint Eastwood listened, his expression carefully controlled, but the shift in dynamic was undeniable. The balance of the conversation had changed. What had once felt like a challenge now felt like something else entirely. A moment of reflection, perhaps even realization. The audience leaned in, not because they were expecting drama anymore, but because they were witnessing something rare. In a world where conflict often escalated quickly, where pride demanded immediate defense, here was a man who refused to be controlled by the situation. Instead, he controlled himself. And in doing so, he controlled the moment. There was something disarming about it. Anger is easy to respond to. It's predictable. It follows a pattern that people understand. But calmness in the face of provocation, that's different. It disrupts expectations. It forces people to reconsider their assumptions, to question their understanding of strength and power. Bruce Lee's reaction did exactly that. He didn't ignore the insult, but he didn't amplify it either. He acknowledged the moment without letting it define him. His words, measured and intentional, carried a message that went beyond the immediate situation. They reflected his philosophy, His belief that true mastery wasn't about defeating others, but about mastering oneself. The studio, once filled with tension, now felt different. The silence was still there, but it was no longer heavy in the same way. It had become attentive, almost respectful. The audience wasn't just watching anymore. They were absorbing, processing, learning. Even those who had come expecting entertainment found themselves drawn into something more meaningful. Clint Eastwood shifted slightly, his earlier confidence now tempered by something else. Whether it was respect, realization, or simply the recognition that the situation had evolved beyond his control, it was difficult to say. But it was clear that Bruce Lee's response had impacted him in a way that a more aggressive reaction might not have. Because aggression invites resistance, calmness invites reflection, and in that moment, Bruce Lee had chosen reflection. The host, sensing the shift, carefully re-entered the conversation, his tone more measured now, more cautious. He attempted to bridge the gap, to bring the discussion back to a place of balance. But even as he spoke, it was clear that something had changed. The moment couldn't be undone, and it couldn't be ignored. It had become part of the narrative. Bruce Lee continued to speak, not at length, but with purpose. Every word seemed intentional, every pause deliberate. He wasn't trying to dominate the conversation. He was guiding it, shaping it in a way that reflected his values. There was no need for raised voices or dramatic gestures. The power of his response lay in its simplicity, in its restraint. The audience responded in kind. There was no immediate applause, no loud reaction. Instead, there was a quiet acknowledgement, a collective understanding that they had witnessed something significant. It wasn't the kind of moment that demanded noise. It was the kind that lingered, that stayed with you, that made you think. Clint Eastwood, for his part, remained composed, but the dynamic between the two men had shifted in a way that couldn't be ignored. The earlier tension, driven by provocation, had given way to something more complex, a subtle exchange of respect, perhaps, or at least an unspoken recognition of the strength that had just been displayed. Bruce Lee's calmness hadn't diminished him, it had elevated him. And in doing so, it had redefined the moment entirely. The silence didn't just linger, it deepened, spreading across the studio like a wave that refused to break. What had started as a moment of shock slowly transformed into something far more intense. It wasn't loud, it wasn't chaotic, but it carried a weight that everyone could feel. The kind of silence where even the smallest movement seemed amplified, where every breath, every glance, every subtle shift became impossible to ignore. The audience sat completely still. No whispers, no nervous laughter, no attempts to fill the gap. It was as if an unspoken understanding had passed through the room. This was not a moment to interrupt. This was something to witness, something that demanded attention, not reaction. Bruce Lee remained composed, his presence now even more commanding than before. It wasn't just about what he had said or how he had responded. It was about the atmosphere he had created. The tension that once threatened to erupt had been transformed into something controlled, something deliberate. And that control didn't just belong to him anymore. It had extended to the entire room. People weren't just watching him, they were feeling the moment. Across the stage, Clint Eastwood sat in a stillness that mirrored the audience, but for very different reasons. The earlier confidence, the sharpness in his tone, the subtle challenge in his posture, it had all softened, replaced by something quieter, more restrained. He hadn't been interrupted, hadn't been confronted with anger or aggression. Instead, he had been met with something far more disarming: calmness. And now, in the absence of conflict, there was nothing to push against. That was what made the silence so powerful. If Bruce Lee had reacted with anger, the moment would have followed a familiar path. Voices would have risen, the audience would have responded, the tension would have exploded, and then eventually faded. But this was different. There was no release, no clear resolution. Just a stillness that seemed to stretch endlessly, forcing everyone to sit with what had just happened. The host, seated between them, felt it more than anyone. His role had always been to guide, to maintain balance, to ensure that the conversation remained engaging but controlled. But now control had slipped into something else entirely. He glanced toward Bruce Lee, then toward Clint Eastwood, searching for a cue, a signal that it was safe to move forward. But neither man offered one, so he waited. The cameras continued to roll, capturing every second of the silence. In the control room, producers watched closely, their usual confidence replaced by uncertainty. Live television thrived on unpredictability, but this kind of unpredictability was different. It wasn't dramatic in the traditional sense. It was quiet, almost unsettling in its restraint. And yet, it was impossible to look away. In the audience, a few individuals shifted slightly in their seats, not out of discomfort but out of awareness. They knew they were witnessing something rare, a moment where power wasn't expressed through dominance, but through presence. Where the absence of action spoke louder than any reaction could. Bruce Lee's gaze remained steady, not confrontational, not aggressive, but unwavering. It was the kind of focus that didn't demand attention, yet commanded it effortlessly. There was no need for further words. What needed to be said had already been communicated, not just through speech, but through his entire demeanor. Clint Eastwood finally moved, just slightly. It wasn't a dramatic gesture. It was small, almost unnoticeable to anyone not paying close attention. A shift in posture, a subtle adjustment of his hands, a brief glance away before returning his focus. But in a moment like this, even the smallest movement carried meaning. Because in silence, everything becomes visible. The confidence he had earlier wasn't gone, but it had changed. It was no longer the dominant force in the room. That role had been taken over by something else, something quieter, yet far more powerful. The audience felt it. Some leaned forward ever so slightly, as if drawn in by an invisible force. Others remained perfectly still, afraid that even the slightest movement might break the moment. It wasn't just about curiosity anymore. It was about respect. Respect for the stillness, for the control, for the unspoken exchange unfolding before them. The host cleared his throat softly, the sound barely audible but enough to ripple through the silence. It wasn't an attempt to interrupt, but rather a cautious step forward, a way to reintroduce movement without disrupting what had been created. "Let's," he began, but the word faded before it could fully form, because even he realized this wasn't a moment to rush. He paused again, allowing the silence to settle just a little longer before carefully choosing his next words. His voice, when it returned, was softer than before, more measured, as if he too had been affected by the shift in energy. But even as he spoke, the focus didn't change. It remained on Bruce Lee. Not because he was demanding attention, but because he had earned it, through restraint, through control, through a reaction that defied expectation. The audience wasn't just watching a person anymore. They were witnessing a principle, a philosophy brought to life in real time. Clint Eastwood listened, his expression neutral but attentive. There was no interruption, no attempt to redirect the conversation back to where it had been. Instead, he allowed it to move forward, following the tone that had been set, not by force but by presence. And the studio followed. The earlier tension, the anticipation of conflict, the expectation of confrontation, it had all dissolved into something else. Something quieter, yet more profound. The silence had done what noise could not. It had shifted the entire atmosphere, changing not just the direction of the conversation but the way everyone experienced it. Even the cameras seemed to capture it differently now. The close-up shots lingered a little longer, the transitions a little slower, as if the production itself had adapted to the moment. There was no rush to cut away, no urgency to fill space. The silence had become part of the story, and it was being treated with the weight it deserved. In homes across the world, viewers sat just as still. What they were seeing wasn't just a conversation. It was a demonstration of composure, of discipline, of a kind of strength that didn't rely on volume or aggression. It was subtle, almost understated, but impossible to ignore. Bruce Lee remained exactly as he was, calm, focused, present. And in that stillness he held the entire room, not through force, but through control. The moment didn't explode the way people had expected. It evolved. What began as tension, sharpened by an insult that cut deeper than most, slowly transformed into something far more powerful. The room was no longer waiting for conflict. It was absorbing something else entirely. Something quieter, but infinitely more impactful. Bruce Lee had already shifted the energy with his calmness, but now it became clear that his response wasn't just about maintaining composure. It carried meaning, intention, and a message that extended beyond the moment itself. Every word he spoke, every pause he allowed, every expression he chose not to show. It all came together as something deliberate. It wasn't just a reaction. It was a statement. The audience could feel it. There was no applause interrupting him, no murmurs breaking the silence. People weren't reacting because they were too focused on understanding. This wasn't entertainment anymore. It had become a lesson unfolding in real time, and no one wanted to miss it. Bruce Lee's voice remained steady, controlled, but now there was a deeper weight behind it. Not anger, not resentment, but clarity. The kind of clarity that doesn't come from impulse, but from discipline. From knowing exactly who you are, what you stand for, and how you choose to respond when that is challenged. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't lean forward aggressively. He didn't need to. Because what he was delivering didn't rely on volume. It relied on truth. The words he chose carried respect, but not submission. Strength, but not hostility. It was a balance that few people could maintain, especially in a moment like this. Most would have been pulled into emotion, into pride, into the need to defend. But Bruce Lee stood somewhere else entirely, above the reaction, yet fully present within it. Clint Eastwood listened, and for the first time since the moment had shifted, there was no sense of control coming from him. He wasn't guiding the conversation anymore. He wasn't steering the tone. He was receiving, taking in what was being said, processing it, perhaps even reassessing what had just happened. Because this wasn't the outcome he had expected. If Bruce Lee had reacted with anger, the situation would have been simple. It would have followed a familiar path: conflict, escalation, resolution. But this response disrupted that pattern. It removed the foundation of confrontation and replaced it with something far more difficult to navigate: reflection. The audience saw it. They could sense the shift not just in Bruce Lee but in Clint Eastwood as well. The earlier edge in his presence had softened. Not completely, not dramatically, but enough to be noticed. Enough to show that something had changed. And that change didn't come from force. It came from control. Bruce Lee continued, his words measured, his tone unwavering. There was no rush in the way he spoke, no urgency to prove anything. He wasn't trying to win the moment. He was defining it, shaping it in a way that reflected not just his character, but his philosophy. Because for him this wasn't just about an insult, it was about what comes after. It was about the choice between reacting and responding, between being driven by emotion and being guided by discipline, between proving strength through aggression and demonstrating it through restraint. And that message didn't just reach Clint Eastwood. It reached everyone. The audience, once tense and uncertain, now sat in a different kind of silence. It wasn't heavy anymore. It was focused, intentional. The kind of silence that comes when people are not just hearing, but truly listening. Even the host seemed changed by it. When he finally spoke again, his tone carried a new level of respect, a carefulness that hadn't been there before. He wasn't just moderating a conversation anymore. He was acknowledging a moment that had grown beyond the usual boundaries of a live broadcast. The cameras captured every detail: the stillness in Bruce Lee's posture, the subtle shift in Clint Eastwood's expression, the quiet attentiveness of the audience. It all became part of the story. And in that story, the power dynamic had completely changed, not through dominance, but through presence. Bruce Lee didn't need to assert control. He had already achieved it, by mastering himself, by refusing to be pulled into a reaction that would diminish the moment, by choosing a path that required more strength, not less. Clint Eastwood adjusted slightly in his seat, his body language no longer carrying the same edge as before. It wasn't submission. It wasn't defeat. It was something more complex, a recognition perhaps that the moment had taken on a depth he hadn't anticipated. Because when faced with calmness, aggression loses its footing. There's nothing to push against, nothing to escalate, only space to reflect. And in that space, people are forced to confront not just the situation, but themselves. The audience could feel that happening, not just on stage, but within themselves as well. The moment had moved beyond the individuals involved. It had become universal, a reflection of how people respond to disrespect, to challenge, to pressure. Bruce Lee's response didn't just answer an insult, it redefined it. It showed that power isn't always loud, that strength doesn't always need to be proven through action, that sometimes the most impactful response is the one that changes the entire direction of a moment without raising a hand. The studio remained quiet, but it was no longer the same silence from before. It had transformed, from tension to understanding, from anticipation to realization, from conflict to clarity. And at the center of it all was Bruce Lee, unshaken, composed, fully in control, not just of himself, but of the moment he had turned into something far greater than anyone had expected.